Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Causality in al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali's cosmology of God's determination and his control over events in his creation through chains of causes, aimed at safeguarding the Sunni doctrine of omnipotence and divine predetermination against the criticism of Mu'tazilites and Shiites. Humans have only the impression of a free will, ikhtiyar. In reality, they are compelled to choose what they deem is the best action, khair, among the present alternatives. Avicenna's determinist ontology, where every event in the created world is by itself a contingent, mumkin al-wujud bizatihi, yet also necessitated by something else, wajib al-wujud bighayrihi, provided a suitable interpretation of God's predetermination and is readily adopted by al-Ghazali, although he never admits that or uses Avicenna's language. In Avicenna, the first being, which is God, makes all other beings and events necessary. In al-Ghazali, God's will, which is distinct from his essence, necessitates all beings and events in creation. The adaptation of fundamental assumptions in Avicenna's cosmology, together with an almost wholesale acceptance of Avicenna's psychology and his prophetology, led Frank to conclude that from a theological standpoint, most of Ibn Sina's theses, which he rejected, are relatively tame and inconsequential compared to those in which he follows the philosopher. While al-Ghazali's determinist cosmology is a radical but faithful interpretation of the Asharite tenet of divine predetermination, the way al-Ghazali writes about it in his revival and later works violates other principles of Asharism and has led to much confusion among modern interpreters. The remainder of this article will make an attempt to resolve current interpretive problems and explain al-Ghazali's innovative approach towards causality. Occasionalism versus secondary causality. Al-Ashari, who died in 935, the founder of the theological school that al-Ghazali belonged to, had rejected the existence of natures, tab'i, and of causal connections among created beings. In a radical attempt to explain God's omnipotence, he combined several ideas that were developed earlier in Muslim Kalam to what became known as Occasionalism. All material things are composed of atoms that have no qualities or attributes but simply make up the shape of the body. The atoms of the bodies are the carrier of accidents, singular arad, which are the attributes like weight, density, color, smell, etc. In the cosmology of al-Ashari, all immaterial things are considered accidents that inhere in a substance, jawhar. Only the atoms of specially extended bodies can be substances. A person's thoughts, for instance, are considered accidents that inhere in the atoms of the person's brain, while his or her faith is an accident inhering in the atoms of the heart. None of the accidents, however, can subsist from one moment, waqt, to the next. This leads to a cosmology wherein each moment God assigns the accidents to bodies in which they inhere. When one moment ends, God creates new accidents. None of the created accidents in the second moment has any causal relation to the ones in the earlier moment. If a body continues to have a certain attribute from one moment to the next, then God creates two identical accidents inhering in that body in each of the two subsequent moments. Movement and development generate when God decides to change the arrangement of the moment before. A ball is moved, for instance, when in the second moment of two, the atoms of the ball happen to be created in a certain distance from the first. The distance determines the speed of the movement. The ball thus jumps and leaps over the playing field, and the same is true for the players' limbs and their bodies. This also applies to the atoms of the air. If there happen to be some wind, in every moment God rearranges all the atoms of this world anew and he creates new accidents, thus creating a new world every moment. All Asharite theologians up to the generation of al-Ghazali, including his teacher al-Juwayni, subscribed to the occasionalist ontology developed by al-Ashari. One of al-Juwayni's late works, the Creed for Nizam al-Mulk al-Aqida an-Nizamiya, shows, however, that he already explored different ontological models, particularly with regard to the effects of human actions. A purely occasionalist model finds it difficult to explain how God can make humans responsible for their own actions if they do not cause them. As a viable alternative to the occasionalist ontology, al-Ghazali considered the Avicennian model of secondary causes. When God wishes to create a certain event, he employs some of his own creations as mediators or secondary causes. God creates series of efficient causes where any superior element causes the existence of the inferior ones. Avicenna stresses that no causal series in any of the four types of causes can regress indefinitely. Every series of causes and effects must have at least three components: a first element, a middle, and a last. In such a chain, only the first element is the cause in the real sense of the word, illah mutlaq, of all subsequent elements. It causes the last element of the chain, the ultimate effect, through one or many intermediaries, mutawasat, which are the middle elements of the chain. Looking at a chain of efficient causes, the finiteness of the causes, Tanahi ilal, serves for Avicenna as the basis of a proof for God's existence. Tracking back all efficient causes in the universe will lead to a first efficient cause, which is itself uncaused. When the first cause is also shown to be incorporeal and numerically one has achieved a proof of God's existence, according to Avicenna. The 17th discussion of the Incoherence. Al-Ghazali offers a brief yet very comprehensive examination of causality within the 17th discussion of the Incoherence of the philosophers. The 17th discussion is not triggered by any opposition to causality. Rather, it aims at forcing al-Ghazali's adversaries, the falasifa, to acknowledge that all prophetical miracles that are reported in the Quran are possible. If their possibility is acknowledged, a Muslim philosopher who accepts the authority of revelation must also admit that the prophets performed these miracles and that the narrative is revelation is truthful. Al-Ghazali divides the 17th discussion into four different sections. He presents three different positions of his various opponents and addresses them one by one. His response to the second position, which is that of Ibn Sina, is further divided into two different approaches. This fourfold division of the 17th discussion is crucial for its understanding. Al-Ghazali addresses different concepts about causality within the different discussions and develops not one, but at least two coherent responses. For a detailed discussion of the four parts in the 17th discussion, the reader must be referred to chapter 6 in Griffel, 2009, page 147 to 73. The following pages give only an outline of Al-Ghazali's overall argument. In the opening sentence of the 17th discussion of Al-Ghazali introduces the position he wishes to refute, and he lines out elements that alternative explanations of causality must include in order to be acceptable for Al-Ghazali. This opening statement is a masterwork of philosophical literature. The connection iktiran between what is habitually believed to be a cause and what is habitually believed to be an effect is not necessary, zaruri, according to us. But with any two things that are not identical and that do not imply one another, it is not necessary that the existence or the non-existence of one follows necessarily, min darura, from the existence or the non-existence of the other. Their connection is due to the prior decision, taqdeer of God, who creates them side by side, ala al-tasawwuq, not to its being necessary by itself, incapable of separation. Al-Ghazali 2000A, page 166. Al-Ghazali lays out four conditions that any explanation of physical processes that is acceptable to him must fulfill. Number one, The connection between a cause and its effect is not necessary. Second, the effect can come to exist without this particular cause, they are not incapable of separation. And third, God creates two events concomitant side by side. And fourth, God's creation follows a prior decision, taqdeer. On first sight, it seems that only an occasionalist explanation of physical processes would fulfill these four conditions, and this is how this statement has mostly been understood. However, pointed out that not only occasionalism but other types of explanations also fulfill these four criteria. Most misleading is the third requirement that God would need to create events side by side. These words seem to point exclusively to an occasionalist understanding of creation. One should keep in mind, however, that this formula leaves open how God creates events. Even an Avicennan philosopher holds that God creates the cause concomitant to its effect, and does so by means of secondary causality. While the 17th discussion of al-Ghazâlî's Incoherence points towards occasionalism as a possible solution, it also points to others. Al-Ghazâlî chose a certain linguistic association to occasionalism, which has led many interpreters of the discussion to believe that here he argues exclusively in favor of it, that is, occasionalism. It is important to understand that al-Ghazâlî does not deny the existence of a connection between a cause and its effect. Rather, he denies the necessary character of this connection. In the first position of the 17th discussion of al-Ghazâlî, brings the argument that observation cannot prove causal connections. Observation can only conclude that the cause and its effect occur concomitantly. Observation mushahada points towards a concomitant occurrence, al-husul indahu, but not to a combined occurrence of al-husul bihi, and that there is no other cause illa for it. Al-Ghazâlî, page 167. It would be wrong, however, to conclude from this argument that al-Ghazâlî denied the existence of causal connections. While such connections cannot be proven through observation or through any other means, they may or may not exist. In the first position, al-Ghazâlî rejects the view that the connection between an efficient cause and its effect is simple necessary per se, meaning that the proximate cause alone is fully responsible for the effect, and that nothing else is also necessary for the effect to occur. In another work, this position is described as one held by materialists Dharyun, who deny that the world has a cause or a maker. Al-Ghazâlî, 1959a, page 19. The Modalities view of Tawallud, meaning that humans are the sole creators of their own actions and their immediate effects, also falls under this position, according to al-Ghazâlî. Like in the connection between a father and his son, where the father is not only the efficient cause for the son's existence, so there may be in every causal connection efficient causes involved other than the most obvious or the most proximate one. The proximate efficient cause may be just the last element in a long chain of efficient causes that extends via the heavenly realm. The intellects of the celestial spheres, which were thought to be referred to in Revelation as angels, may be middle elements or intermediaries in causal chains that all have its beginning in God. Al-Ghazâlî rejects the position of the materialists and the Modalities because it does not take account of the fact that God is the ultimate efficient cause of the observed effect. God may create this effect directly or by way of secondary causality. Discussing the example that when fire touches a ball of cotton, it causes it to combust. Al-Ghazâlî writes about the first position, that the fire alone causes combustion. And he writes, this position is one of those that we deny. Rather, we say that the efficient cause, fa'il, of the combustion through the creation of blackness in the cotton and through causing the separation of its parts and turning it into coal or ashes is God, either through the mediation of the angels or without mediation. Secondary causality is a viable option for al-Ghazâlî that he is willing to accept. Still, he does not accept the teachings of Avicenna, which are discussed in the second position. Avicenna combines secondary causality with the view that causal processes proceed with necessity and in accord with the nature of things, and not by way of deliberation and choice on the side of the efficient cause. The ultimate efficient cause in a cosmology of secondary causality is, of course, God. The Avicennan opponent of the second position teaches secondary causality, plus he holds that the causal connections follow with necessity from the nature of the first being. They are not created through God's deliberation and choice, but are a necessary effect of God's essence. 2. two different concepts of the modalities. When al-Ghazâlî writes that the connection between a cause and its effect is not necessary, he attacks Ibn Sina's necessitarian ontology, not his secondary causality. The dispute between al-Ghazâlî and Ibn Sina is not about causality as such, rather about the necessary nature of God's creation. Kukkonen and Dutton have shown that the two start with quite different assumptions about necessity. Ibn Sina's view of the modalities follows the statistical model of Aristotle and connects the possibility of a thing to its temporal actuality. A temporal, unqualified sentence like, "Fire causes cotton to combust," contains implicitly or explicitly a reference to the time of utterance as part of its meaning. If this sentence is true whenever uttered, it is necessarily true. If its truth value can change in the course of time, it is possible. If such a sentence is false whenever uttered, it is impossible. In Aristotelian modal theories, modal terms were taken to refer to the one and only historical world of ours. For Avicenna, fire necessarily causes cotton to combust because the sentence, "Fire causes cotton to combust," was, is, and will always be true. Al-Ghazali's understanding of the modalities developed in the context of Asharite Kalam and does not share the statistical model of Aristotle and Avicenna. Asharite Kalam developed an understanding that is closer to our modern view of the modalities as referring to synchronic alternative states of affairs. In the modern model, the notion of necessity refers to what obtains in all alternatives. The notion of possibility refers to what obtains in at least in one alternative, and that which is impossible does not obtain in any conceivable state of affairs. Nutila, 1998, page 145. Asharite Kalam pursued the notion that God is the particularizing agent, mukhassis of all events in the world, who determines, for instance, when things come into existence and when they fall out of existence. The idea of particularization, takhsis, includes implicitly an understanding of possible worlds that are different from this. The process of particularization makes one of the several alternatives actual. In his creed for Nizam al-Mulk, al-Juwayni explained the Asharite understanding of the modalities. Every sound-thinking person finds within herself the knowledge about the possibility of what is possible, the necessity of what is necessary, and the impossibility of what is impossible. Al-Juwayni, 1948, page 8 to 9. We know this distinction instinctively without learning it from others and without further inquiry into the world. It's an impulse badiha in our rational judgment, aql. Al-Juwayni explains this impulse. The impulsive possibility that the intellect rushes to apprehend without any consideration, thinking, or inquiry is what becomes evident to the intelligent person when he sees a building. The building is a possibility that comes into being min jawaz hudusihi. The person knows decisively and offhand that the actual state, hudus, of that building is from among its possible states, jaizat, and that it is not impossible in the intellect had it not been built. Al-Juwayni. The intelligent person, al-aqil, here simply meaning a person with full rational capacity, realizes that all the features of the building, its height, its length, its form, are actualized possibilities and could be different. The same applies to the time when the building is built. We immediately realize Al-Juwayni says that there is a synchronic alternative state to the actual building. This is what we call possibility, or more precisely, contingency, imkan. Realizing that there is such an alternative is an important part of our understanding. The intelligent person cannot realize in his mind anything about the state of the building without comparing it with what is contingent like it, imkani mislihi, or what is different from it, khilafihi. Al-Juwayni, 1948, page number 9. In at least 3 passages of the Incoherence, al-Ghazâlî criticizes Ibn Sina's understanding of the modalities. Here he refers to another, closely related dispute, namely that for Avicenna, the modalities exist in reality, while for al-Ghazâlî they exist only as judgments in the minds of humans. He denies Avicenna's premise that possibility needs a substrate. This premise is Aristotelian. It is the basis to the principle of entelechy, namely that all things have potentialities and are driven to actualize them. Al-Ghazâlî shifts, as Kukkonen puts it, the locus of the presumption of a thing's actual existence, from the plane of the actualized reality to the plane of mental conceivability. When al-Ghazâlî says that according to us, the connection between the efficient cause and its effect is not necessary, he aims to point out that the connection could be different even if it never will be different. For Avicenna, the fact that the connection never was different and never will be different implies that it is necessary. Nowhere in his works requires al-Ghazâlî that any given causal connection was different or will be different in order to be considered not necessary. We will see that he, like Ibn Sina, assumes causal connections never were and never will be different from what they are now. Still, they are not necessary, he maintains. The connection between a cause and its effect is contingent because an alternative to it is conceivable in our minds. We can imagine a world where fire does not cause cotton to combust, or to continue reading the initial statement of the 17th discussion. It is within divine power to create satiety without eating, to create death without a deep cut, huzz in the neck, to continue life after having received a deep cut in the neck, and so on to all connected things. The philosopher denies the possibility of this and claim it to be impossible. Of course, a world where fire doesn't cause combustion in cotton would be radically different from the one we live in. A change in a single causal connection would probably imply that many others would be different as well. Still, such a world can be conceived in our minds, which means it's a possible world. God, however, did not choose to create such an alternative possible world. In the initial statement of the 17th discussion, al-Ghazâlî claims that the connection between cause and effect is due to the prior decision, taqdeer of God. When he objects to Avicenna that these connections are not necessary, al-Ghazâlî wishes to point out that God could have chosen to create an alternative world where the causal connections are different from what they are. Avicenna denies this. This world is the necessary effect of God's nature, and a world different from this one is unconceivable. Al-Ghazâlî objects and says this world is the contingent effect of God's free will and his deliberate choice between alternative worlds. The Cum-Possibility of Occasionalism and Secondary Causality. In the second position of the 17th discussion, al-Ghazâlî presents two different approaches in order to counter Ibn Sina's position that the necessary connection between existing causes and effects renders some miracles in the Quran impossible. In the first approach, al-Ghazâlî denies the existence of natures, tab'i, and of causal connections, and maintains that God creates every event immediately. This is the part of the 17th discussion where he presents Occasionalism as a viable explanation of what we have usually come to refer as efficient causality. God's eternal and unchanging knowledge already contains all events that will happen in creation. By creating combustion every time fire touches cotton, God follows a certain custom ada. In real terms, however, combustion occurs only concomitantly when fire touches cotton and is not connected to this event. In the first approach of the second position in the 17th discussion, al-Ghazâlî in some of his later works maintains that causal processes may simply be the result of God's habit. And that he creates what we consider a cause and its effect individually and immediately. When God wishes to perform a miracle and confirm the mission of one of his prophets, he suspends his habit and omits to create the effect he usually does according to his habit. The second approach. The second approach of al-Ghazâlî presents a very different explanation of prophetic miracles. Marmura called it al-Ghazâlî's second causal theory. Here al-Ghazâlî accepts the existence of natures, tab'i, and of unchanging connections between causes and their effects. In the second causal theory, al-Ghazâlî merely points out that despite human efforts in the natural sciences, we are far away from knowing all causes and explaining all processes in nature. It may be well the case that those miracles that the philosopher deny have immanent natural causes that are unknown to us. When Moses, for instance, threw his stick to the ground and it changed into a serpent, Quran, chapter 7, verse 107. The material of the wooden stick may have undergone a rapid transformation and become a living animal. We know that wood disintegrates within time and becomes earth that fertilizes and feeds plants. These plants are in turn the fodder of herbivores, which are consumed by carnivores like snakes. The philosopher cannot exclude that some unknown cause acts as a catalyst and may rapidly expedite the usually slow process where the matter of evidence stick is transformed into a snake. These and other explanations given in the second approach are only example of how the prophetical miracles may be result of natural causes that are not fully understood by humans. Marmura rejected the suggestion that al-Ghazâlî might have held occasionalism and secondary causality as two possible cosmological explanations. Marmura considered that al-Ghazâlî makes use of causalist language, sometimes in the way it is used in ordinary Arabic, sometimes in a more specifically Avicennan and Aristotelian way. And this usage of language is innovative for the Asharite school discourse. Yet in all major points of Muslim theology, al-Ghazâlî held positions that follow closely the ones developed by early Asharite scholars, namely the possibility of miracles, the creation of human acts, and God's freedom during the creation of the universe. In Marmura's view, al-Ghazâlî never deviated from occasionalism, while he sometimes expressed his opinions in an ambiguous language that mocked philosophical parlance, probably in order to lure followers of philosopher into the Asharite occasionalist camp. Al-Ghazâlî considered occasionalism and secondary causality as possible explanation of God's creative activities, stated, however, in a passage in the 20th discussion of the Incoherence on the subject of corporeal resurrection in the afterlife. The philosopher argued that corporeal resurrection is impossible because it requires the transformation of substances like iron into a garment, which is impossible. In his response, al-Ghazâlî refers to the second approach of the second position in the 17th discussion, where he says he had already discussed this problem. He argues that the unusually rapid recycling of the matter that makes up the piece of iron into a piece of garment is not impossible. But this is not the point at issue here, al-Ghazâlî says. The real question is whether such a transformation occurs purely through divine power, without an intermediary, or through one of the causes. He continues. Both these two views are possible for us. Kilahuma mumkinan indana. In the 17th discussion, we stated that the connection of connected things in existence is not by way of necessity but through habitual events, which can be disrupted. Thus, these events come about through the power of God without the existence of their causes. The second view is that we say this is due to causes, but it is not a condition that the cause would be one that is well known. Rather, in the treasury of things that are enacted by God's power, there are wondrous and strange things that one hasn't come across. These are denied by someone who thinks that only those things exist that he experiences, similar to people who deny magic, sorcery, the talismanic arts, prophetic miracles, and the wondrous deeds done by saints. Al-Ghazâlî maintained this undecided position throughout his lifetime. Given the fact that neither observation nor any other means of knowing, including revelation, gives a decisive proof for the existence or non-existence of a connection between a cause and its effect, we must suspend our judgment on this matter. God may create through the mediation of causes that he employs, or directly without such mediation. This undecided position is unfortunately nowhere clearly explained. It can be gathered from isolated statements like the one above and the fact that after the Incoherence, al-Ghazâlî wrote books where he maintained a distinctly occasionalist cosmology, and others like the 35th book of his Revival or the Niche of Lights, where he uses language that is explicitly causalist. In none of these books, however, he commits himself to the position that the cause is connected to its effect. God may create the two independently from one another, or he may create them through the mediation of secondary causes. In his very last work, completed only days before his death, al-Ghazâlî discusses whether God creates through the mediation, vivasita, of his creations or not, and maintains that the matter cannot be settled decisively. In all this, al-Ghazâlî accepted the unchanging character of this creation. Once God chose to create this world among alternatives, he also chose not to change the rules that govern it. While it is conceivable and therefore possible that God would break his habit or intervene in the assigned function of the secondary causes, he informs us in his revelation that he will not do so. In the 31st book of his Revival, al-Ghazâlî says that God creates all things one after the other in an orderly manner. After making clear that this order represents God's habit, he quotes the Quran. You will not find any change in God's habit. This verse is quoted several times in the Revival. In one passage, al-Ghazâlî adds that we should not think God will ever change his habit. Prophetical miracles are merely extraordinary occurrences. that take place within the system of the strictly habitual operation of God's actions or within the natural laws that govern the secondary causes. Miracles are programmed into God's plan for His creation, so to speak, from the very beginning, and do not represent a direct intervention or a suspension of God's lawful actions. Given that there will never be a break in God's habit, an occasionalist universe will always remain indistinguishable from one governed by secondary causality.